Pine Valley nestled beneath towering mountains where mist clung to the treetops like a mourning veil. On this autumn morning, the small town of just over 3,000 souls fell silent as black-dressed figures made their way to the cemetery. On the outskirts, every shop had closed its doors. Every window displayed a black ribbon. The entire community moved as one toward the final resting place of Tom Henderson, their beloved forest ranger of 25 years. The cemetery sat at the edge of the forest where civilization met wilderness, a place Tom had guarded and protected for most of his life. Dark clouds loomed overhead, matching the somber mood as mourners gathered under the ancient oak trees. Sarah Henderson, Tom's widow, stood straight-backed, but her trembling hands betrayed her grief as she clutched a framed photo of her husband in his ranger uniform. Their daughter Emma, who had followed in her father's footsteps and become a wildlife biologist, supported her mother's arm. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry, as if she had exhausted all her tears in the days since the accident. The official report called it a tragic fall while patrolling the higher trails, but something about the circumstances felt wrong to those who knew Tom best. Pine Valley wasn't just any mountain town. Here, the wilderness wasn't simply a backdrop, but a living presence that shaped every aspect of life. Tom had understood this better than anyone. He knew every trail, every seasonal marking, and most importantly, every bear that roamed these mountains. He had developed a special way of tracking and managing the local wildlife that kept both animals and humans safe. His methods had become legendary among other rangers who came from far and wide to learn from him. The townsfolk whispered about Tom's almost supernatural connection with the forest, how he could sense when a storm was coming hours before the Weather Service issued warnings, how he knew exactly where to find lost hikers, as if the trees themselves whispered their locations to him. How he could calm an aggressive bear with just his presence and soft words. These weren't just stories. Everyone had witnessed his gift firsthand. Mayor Wilson stood at the podium they had set up near the fresh grave, his voice heavy with emotion as he addressed the gathering crowd. Today we lay to rest not just a forest ranger, but a guardian of our way of life. The words carried across the hushed cemetery, where even the wind seemed to pause in respect. But there was tension beneath the surface of grief. Whispers circulated among the mourners about strange events in the weeks leading up to Tom's death. He had been agitated, spending long hours in his office reviewing old reports. Sarah had mentioned finding him up late at night, poring over maps of the forest's deepest sections. Emma remembered their last conversation, where her father had seemed distracted, almost afraid. He had tried to tell her something important about the North Ridge but was called away before he could finish. The local wildlife had been acting strangely too. The bears, usually predictable in their patterns, had been seen closer to town than ever before. Deer abandoned their usual grazing grounds. Even the birds seemed to carry warning calls in their songs. Tom had noticed it all, had been tracking these changes with growing concern. As the funeral preparations continued, no one noticed the unusual silence descending over the forest. The typical morning chorus of birds had fallen quiet. The constant rustle of leaves in the mountain breeze ceased, as if nature itself held its breath. Only the most attuned would have sensed it. Tom would have noticed immediately. The gathering crowd grew larger as more townspeople arrived, their footsteps crunching on the gravel paths between the gravestones. Each person carried not just grief but questions. Why had such an experienced ranger fallen on a trail he knew like the back of his hand? Why had search and rescue found his equipment scattered so far from his body? Why had he been up there alone when he always preached about mountain safety? These questions hung in the air as heavy as the threatening storm clouds above, but no one dared voice them aloud. Not here, not now. Instead, they focused on comforting Sarah and Emma, on remembering Tom's warmth, his dedication, his love for the wilderness he had spent his life protecting. None of them could have known that nature itself was about to intervene in their mourning, that the truth Tom had died protecting was about to emerge in the most extraordinary way, and that a bear, one of the very creatures Tom had devoted his life to protecting, would soon throw their careful funeral preparations into chaos. Thunder rumbled in the distance as funeral director Michael Stevens supervised the final arrangements at the graveside. The morning had brought with it an unsettling darkness, the kind that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. The weather forecast had promised clear skies, but nature seemed to have other plans, just as unpredictable as the circumstances that had brought them all here. The pallbearers, all fellow rangers who had worked alongside Tom, gathered near the hearse, their faces etched with concern as they glanced at the threatening sky. They had worked through the early hours ensuring the grave was perfectly prepared, the chairs properly arranged, and the temporary shelter secured against the rising wind. But something felt off. The tarp covering the seating area flapped violently, despite their best efforts to anchor it. Sarah Henderson arrived early with Emma to oversee the final preparations. Her fingers traced the polished wood of Tom's coffin, lingering over the simple brass nameplate. The funeral home had suggested a more elaborate casket, but Sarah knew Tom would have wanted something understated, something that reflected his connection to the natural world. Still, as she stood there, a strange sensation washed over her. The coffin felt wrong somehow, though she couldn't explain why. The cemetery workers moved with careful precision, their usual efficiency hampered by an inexplicable nervousness. One of them, Joe Martinez, who had dug graves here for 20 years, kept pausing to look over his shoulder at the tree line. "Something ain't right," he muttered to his colleague. "The animals are too quiet. Haven't seen a single bird all morning." Emma noticed it too. As a wildlife biologist, she was attuned to the forest's rhythms just as her father had been. The usual morning chorus of birds was absent, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to creep down from the mountains. She watched a cluster of deer emerge from the forest edge only to freeze, sniff the air, and bolt away as if frightened by something unseen. The first mourners began arriving, their cars forming a somber procession along the narrow cemetery road. Each new arrival commented on the strange atmosphere. The air felt heavy, charged with something more than just grief. Even those who had lived in Pine Valley their entire lives, who were used to the mountain's moods, sensed something unusual brewing. Pastor Roberts arrived to prepare for the service, his black robe billowing in the strengthening wind. As he arranged, his notes on the podium, papers scattered across the cemetery. Several mourners rushed to help collect them, but stopped short as an unusually loud crack echoed from the forest. Everyone turned to look, but the trees revealed nothing. The funeral. Home staff struggled with the flower arrangements, which kept toppling in the gusting wind. White lilies, Tom's favorite, scattered their petals across the ground like snow. Sarah watched them dance away, remembering how Tom would bring her wildflowers from his patrols. The memory stirred something else, something he had said in those final days about unusual tracks near the lily fields on the North Ridge. More thunder rolled overhead, closer now. The air grew thick with humidity and the temperature dropped noticeably. Several mourners huddled closer together, sharing concerned whispers about the weather and whether they should move the service indoors. But the nearest church was 20 minutes away, and the funeral director insisted they proceed as planned. As the final preparations concluded, Emma helped her mother to her seat in the front row. The coffin stood before them, draped with the Forest Service flag, waiting to be lowered into the ground. But just as the pastor prepared to begin, a sound carried down from the mountains. It might have been the wind playing tricks, might have been just another rumble of thunder. But to Emma's trained ear it sounded unmistakably like a bear's distant roar. Sarah grabbed her daughter's hand, squeezing it tight. Both women knew what the other was thinking. Tom would have known what it meant. He would have read the signs, understood the forest's warning. But Tom wasn't here to guide them anymore. Or was he? Pastor Roberts cleared his throat and opened his Bible, his voice carrying across the now crowded cemetery. Nearly the entire town had gathered, standing shoulder to shoulder around the grave. The first drops of rain began to fall, gentle at first, creating tiny dark spots on the mourners' black clothing. Mayor Wilson stepped forward to deliver the first eulogy, his paper already damp in his trembling hands. "Tom Henderson was more than just our forest ranger," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "He was the bridge between our world and the wilderness." As he spoke, several people nodded, dabbing at their eyes. He shared stories of how Tom had saved countless hikers, protected endangered species, and kept the delicate balance between civilization and nature. Sarah listened, lost in memories of her own. 20 years of marriage played through her mind like a film reel, each frame precious and painful now. But as the mayor continued speaking, she noticed something that pulled her from her reverie. The rain had stopped, but only over the cemetery. Looking up, she saw dark clouds still churning overhead, while rain continued to fall in the surrounding forest. Emma shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The silence from the forest had grown deeper, more absolute. Even the wind seemed to move, without sound now. She watched as a fox emerged from the underbrush, something she had never seen during daylight hours. It stood at the forest's edge, watching the gathering with unusual intensity before disappearing back into the shadows. Tom's oldest friend and fellow ranger, Jack Thompson, took the podium next. His hands shook as he unfolded his speech. Tom knew these mountains better than anyone, he began. He always said that nature speaks to us if we're willing to listen. Jack paused, distracted by movement in his peripheral vision. Several others turned to look as well, but saw only shadows dancing between the trees. The temperature dropped further, causing mourners to pull their jackets tighter. Someone's child started crying, a sharp sound that cut through the heavy air. The parent quickly hushed them, but the damage was done. The unnatural silence had been broken, and now everyone seemed to notice it. Jack continued his eulogy, sharing a story about the time Tom had tracked a wounded bear for 3 days to help. He had this way with animals, Jack said, his voice cracking. They trusted him almost like they could sense his heart. As if in response to these words, another deep rumble echoed from the mountains, closer this time. Several people jumped, and a murmur rippled through the crowd. Pastor Roberts glanced nervously at the funeral director, who nodded for him to continue with the service. But as he began to speak, the flags on nearby veterans' graves suddenly went still despite the continued wind. The flowers on Tom's coffin trembled, though there was no breeze to move them. Emma leaned forward, her scientific mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. The air felt charged like just before a lightning strike. She noticed small pebbles on the ground vibrating, creating tiny patterns in the dirt. Her father had taught her to read nature's warnings, and everything around them screamed that something was coming. Sarah grabbed her daughter's arm, pointing wordlessly toward the forest edge. Others followed their gaze. Through the trees, something large was moving, branches swaying against the natural flow of wind. The movement was purposeful, deliberate, coming straight toward the gathering. Pastor Robert's voice faltered as he read from Psalm 23. The words, "Through the valley of the shadow of death," seemed to hang in the air, taking on new meaning. The atmosphere had shifted from somber to charged with tension. Every person present could feel it, like electricity crackling just beneath their skin. Then they heard it. A sound that started as a low groan, coming from the direction of Tom's coffin. At first, many thought they had imagined it. But when it came again, louder this time, there was no denying it. Something was wrong, very wrong. The massive grizzly emerged from the tree line with deliberate steps, its brown fur glistening with rain. This was no ordinary bear. Those familiar with local wildlife immediately recognized it as Old Ben, the largest grizzly in the region, and one Tom had studied for years. The bear stood at its full height, nearly 9 feet tall, its presence commanding complete stillness from the gathered mourners. Time seemed to freeze. No one moved. No one breathed. Parents instinctively pulled their children closer. The funeral director's hand hovered over his phone, ready to call emergency services, but fear kept him from making any sudden movements. The bear's dark eyes surveyed the scene with an almost human intelligence, focusing on the gathering with unsettling intensity. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as recognition dawned. This was the same bear Tom had shown her photographs of countless times, the one he had named after his grandfather because of its wise, careful nature. Old Ben never acts without reason, Tom had always said. Now, watching the creature's purposeful approach, his words echoed in her mind with new meaning. The bear moved forward, its massive paws silent on the wet grass. Its behavior defied everything Emma knew about grizzly bears. There was no aggression, no signs of being startled or threatened by the large group of humans. Instead, it moved with what could only be described as determination, heading straight for the center of the gathering. Panic began to ripple through the crowd in silent waves. Several people took small steps backward, creating a widening circle around Tom's coffin. But remarkably, the bear showed no interest in the retreating humans. Its focus remained fixed on one thing only: the wooden casket draped with the Forest Service flag. Old Ben approached the coffin with the same careful deliberation he had shown since emerging from the forest. His movements were almost ceremonial, as if he too had come to pay respects. To those watching, it seemed impossible, yet they couldn't deny what they were seeing. The bear that Tom had studied and protected for so many years had come to his funeral. The tension in the air grew unbearable, as old Ben circled the coffin once, then twice. His nose twitched, sampling the air. Something about his behavior suggested he wasn't just investigating, he was searching. With each passing moment, his movements became more focused, more intentional. Emma watched in professional fascination, her scientific mind warring with her fear. She had inherited her father's gift for reading animal behavior, and everything about old Ben's demeanor screamed that he was trying to communicate something. The bear's muscles were relaxed, his ears forward, displaying none of the typical signs of aggression. A low rumble emanated from the bear's throat, not threatening but almost mournful. He stopped at the head of the coffin, rising again to his full height. The pastor, who had been frozen mid-prayer, dropped his Bible. The soft thud caused several people to flinch, but old Ben remained focused on his task, whatever it might be. Then, in a movement that drew gasps from the crowd, the bear gently placed one massive paw on the coffin's lid. The wood creaked under his weight, and for a moment, everyone feared he would crush it. But his touch was surprisingly delicate, almost reverent, as if he knew exactly how much pressure to apply. The groan they had heard earlier came again, louder this time, definitely from inside the coffin. Old Ben's reaction was immediate. His ears perked forward, and he let out a soft woof of breath, the kind bears use when they've found something interesting. He moved his paw slowly along the coffin's surface, as if searching for something specific. Sarah stepped forward, despite Emma's attempt to hold her back. Something about the bear's behavior sparked a memory of Tom's last days, his agitation, his cryptic warnings about the North Ridge. The bear turned his head toward her, acknowledging her presence without aggression. In that moment, looking into old Ben's dark eyes, Sarah felt a connection to her late husband that took her breath away. The bear's attention returned to the coffin, and he did something that defied explanation. With precise movements, he began, applying pressure to specific points along the lid, almost as if he was testing it. The wood creaked again, and this time, the sound that emerged from within was unmistakable. It was no settling of wood or trick of the wind. Something was inside that coffin, something alive. What happened next unfolded in a matter of seconds, though those present would later say it felt like hours. Old Ben's massive paw pressed against the coffin's lid with increasing pressure, his movements deliberate and focused. The wood began to splinter, the sound of cracking timber echoing across the now silent cemetery. Sarah stepped forward again, her voice barely a whisper. "Wait." The bear paused, as if acknowledging her words. In that moment of stillness, everyone heard it, clear and unmistakable. A muffled cry for help from inside the coffin. Horror swept through the crowd like a sudden winter wind. Several people stumbled backward. Others stood rooted to the spot, unable to process what they were hearing. Emma's scientific mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. The funeral director rushed forward, keys in hand, but old Ben's low growl stopped him in his tracks. The bear returned his attention to the coffin, now working with renewed purpose. His claws found purchase in the splintering wood, and with surprising precision he began to peel back the lid. The Forest Service flag fluttered to the ground, and the brass handles groaned under the pressure. Inside the coffin, the movement grew more frantic. The muffled sounds became clearer, more desperate. Someone in the crowd screamed, setting off a chain reaction of gasps and cries. But no one ran. They were all transfixed by the scene unfolding before them, unable to look away from what was quickly becoming clear was not a funeral, but something far more sinister. As the lid finally gave way, sunlight poured into the coffin, revealing not Tom Henderson's body, but a young man, bound and gagged, his eyes wide with terror and relief. Park Ranger, Jack Thompson's face drained of all color as he recognized the victim, David Chen, the environmental investigator who had gone missing 2 weeks before Tom's death. Old Ben stepped back, his task completed, maintaining a protective stance near the coffin. Emma and several others rushed forward to help David, who was weak but alive. As they removed his gag and bonds, he gasped for air, his first words sending chills through the gathering. Tom found out. They killed him because he found out. Sarah swayed on her feet as the implications hit her. Her husband's strange behavior in his final days, his cryptic warnings, his accident on the trail, all of it suddenly taking on a horrifying new meaning. She remembered his last words to her. "If anything happens to me, trust the forest, it knows the truth." The sound of approaching sirens pierced the air, someone having had the presence of mind to call the authorities. But even as police cars began pulling up to the cemetery, more revelations were spilling from David's trembling lips. Words like timber smuggling, endangered species trafficking, and corrupt officials fell like bombs on the stunned crowd. Old Ben remained in place, his massive form a silent sentinel, as if ensuring his task was completely finished. His behavior, so unusual for a wild animal, suddenly made perfect sense to Emma. Her father had always said that bears had an incredible sense of smell, that old Ben in particular could track scents others couldn't detect. The bear hadn't come to the funeral by chance. He had followed the scent of a living person, trapped inside what should have been a final resting place. The truth was emerging, piece by horrifying piece. Tom Henderson hadn't died in an accident. He had been silenced, because he had discovered something terrible happening in his beloved forest, and now through the most unlikely of circumstances, through the connection he had fostered with the wilderness he protected, the truth was finally coming to light. As state police began cordoning off the area and taking statements, old Ben, slowly, backed away toward the forest. He had done what he came to do. The bear's final glance toward the gathered mourners seemed to carry a message, one that Tom would have understood perfectly. Nature always finds a way to restore balance. As police secured the cemetery and paramedics tended to David Chen, a story of corruption and murder began to unfold that shook Pine Valley to its core. David, still shivering despite the blanket wrapped around his shoulders, revealed the dark truth to the investigating officers, while the stunned mourners listened in horrified silence. 3 weeks ago, during a routine inspection of the North Ridge, David had discovered evidence of an elaborate criminal operation. Protected hardwoods were being harvested illegally at night, while endangered species were being captured and sold on the black market. The operation had been cleverly disguised as a legitimate logging operation, with falsified permits and doctored environmental impact reports. Sarah remembered the late nights Tom had spent poring over maps and old reports. He had noticed the discrepancies first. Changes in wildlife patterns, trees missing from protected areas, unauthorized vehicles in restricted zones. Like pieces of a puzzle, it all started coming together. Tom had connected the strange animal behaviors to the illegal activities, realizing that the poaching and logging were driving wildlife from their natural habitats. David's voice shook as he described how he had taken his findings to Tom, knowing the veteran ranger's reputation for integrity. Together they had gathered evidence, photographed the illegal logging sites, and documented the poaching operations. But someone had discovered their investigation. The same night they had planned to contact federal authorities, David disappeared. Emma stood beside her mother, her mind racing through memories of her last conversation with her father. His distracted manner, his attempt to tell her something about the North Ridge. He had known then that he was in danger, had tried to warn her. The strange behavior of the wildlife, the bears appearing closer to town, the silence in the forest. Nature itself had been trying to sound the alarm. The mayor's face had turned ashen as names began to emerge. Respected members of the community, business leaders, even some local officials were implicated in the scandal. The legitimate logging operation had been a front, allowing them to exploit the forest's resources while maintaining a veneer of respectability. Tom's death had been staged to look like an accident, a tragic fall that no one would question. Old Ben's appearance at the funeral suddenly made perfect sense. The bear's keen sense of smell had detected David's presence inside the coffin, where the conspirators had hidden him after learning that state investigators were coming to look into Tom's death. They had planned to dispose of both their problems at once, burying their secret quite literally with their victim. Sarah approached David, her grief now mingled with a fierce determination. "Tell me who did this to my husband," she demanded, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. David's answer made her stagger back. The conspiracy reached higher than anyone had imagined, involving people they had trusted, people who were standing among them even now. The revelation caused immediate chaos in the crowd. Accusations flew as people began to understand the magnitude of the betrayal. Some of the mourners, their faces now masks of guilt, tried to slip away but were stopped by the police. Others stood in shocked silence, realizing that people they had known their entire lives were capable of murder. Through it all, old Ben remained at the forest's edge, watching. His presence served as a reminder of Tom's deep connection to the wilderness he had died protecting. The bear's instincts had revealed what human corruption had tried to hide. In death, Tom's lifetime of respecting and understanding nature had helped bring his killers to justice. Emma noticed something else too. Other animals had begun to emerge from the forest, gathering at the tree line. Deer, foxes, and even a few more bears stood in silent witness. It was as if the entire forest had come to ensure justice was done. Her father had always said that animals were more aware than humans gave them credit for. Now she understood exactly what he had meant. The truth of Tom Henderson's death would send shockwaves through the community for years to come. The illegal logging operation had caused millions in environmental damage, endangered countless protected species, and ultimately led to murder. But through a series of events that no one could have predicted, through the very connection to nature that Tom had nurtured throughout his life, the truth had finally emerged. As state police began making arrests, Sarah picked up the Forest Service flag that had fallen from the coffin. Looking toward the assembled wildlife at the forest's edge, she understood what Tom had meant in his final days. The forest always knows, and today, through old Ben, it had spoken. In the weeks following the extraordinary events at Pine Valley Cemetery, the town underwent a profound transformation. The investigation revealed that Tom Henderson had died a hero, attempting to protect not just the forest but the very soul of the community he loved. His final acts had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately save the wilderness he had dedicated his life to preserving. The state's investigation led to dozens of arrests, reaching far beyond Pine Valley's boundaries. The illegal logging operation had connections to international wildlife trafficking rings, with profits in the millions. As each layer of corruption was exposed, the town learned the true extent of Tom's courage. He had stood alone against a powerful criminal enterprise, choosing to protect the forest even when it cost him everything. Sarah found a measure of peace in the weeks that followed. While cleaning Tom's office at the ranger station, she discovered a hidden journal detailing everything he had uncovered. His final entry revealed that he had known the danger he faced but couldn't stand by and watch as the forest was destroyed. "Some things are worth dying for," he had written. "The wilderness has always taken care of us, now it's our turn to protect it." The forest itself seemed to heal as the illegal operations were shut down. Wildlife returned to their natural patterns, and old Ben was often seen patrolling the North Ridge, just as he had done with Tom. The bear's role in revealing the truth became local legend, a story that would be told for generations about the day nature itself had intervened to ensure justice was served. Emma took over her father's position as head ranger, implementing many of the protective measures he had fought for. Under her leadership, Pine Valley established one of the country's most comprehensive forest conservation programs. The Henderson Wildlife Sanctuary was created, with special protections for the bears Tom had studied so carefully. The community's healing process was slow but steady. Those who had been deceived by the criminal enterprise worked to restore what had been damaged. Local businesses contributed to reforestation efforts, and volunteers helped rebuild destroyed wildlife habitats. The tragedy had taught Pine Valley the true value of what Tom had always protected. David Chen recovered and became a key witness in the federal prosecution. He established a foundation in Tom's name, dedicated to training future rangers in the principles of conservation and wildlife protection that Tom had championed. The foundation's symbol, fittingly, was a grizzly bear. On the one-year anniversary of that extraordinary funeral, Sarah and Emma stood at Tom's real grave, finally laid to rest with the honor he deserved. The ceremony was small, attended by those who had truly known and loved him. As they stood there, a familiar figure emerged from the trees. Old Ben, now a welcomed guardian of the forest, watched from a respectful distance. Pine Valley would never be the same, but perhaps that was Tom's final gift to the town. The community had learned the true meaning of conservation, understanding that protecting the wilderness meant protecting their own future. The balance between nature and civilization that Tom had always championed became the foundation of the town's new identity. As Sarah placed wildflowers on Tom's grave, a sudden breeze carried the scent of pine and earth. For a moment she felt Tom's presence in the wind that rustled through the trees, in the distant call of birds, in the watchful gaze of old Ben. The forest he loved had become his legacy, a living testament to one man's dedication to preserving the delicate balance between wilderness and civilization. Pine Valley had learned its lesson. The forest wasn't just a resource to be exploited, but a partner to be protected. And somewhere, Sarah knew, Tom was smiling, knowing that his beloved wilderness was finally safe in the hands of those who understood its true value. Did you enjoy this gripping tale where nature and justice intertwined in an unexpected way? Join our growing community of storytellers and adventure seekers on YouTube, where we bring you thrilling stories like this every week. From mysterious encounters in the wilderness to heartwarming tales of animal intelligence, our channel delivers captivating narratives that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to ensure you never miss our latest uploads. Each story is carefully crafted with immersive sound effects and professional narration to transport you right into the heart of the action. Whether you're a nature enthusiast, mystery lover, or just someone who enjoys a well-told tale, our channel has something special waiting for you. Like, share, and become part of our story-loving family today. Together, let's explore the extraordinary stories that remind us of the magic and mystery that still exists in our world.